You need this?
Please. Good morning. Wonderful to be with you all today. Sitting here with the group today, this brings to mind and brings to bear just what we are sometimes caused to go through in our lives. Loss and grief, death. And that's why I've been invited to come today and talk a little bit about that. And so let me just say and tell you that I'm happy to be here with you today, to be among people who yearn to give of themselves through love, in service to others, a compassionate, loving response to Jesus, who says that when you cared for the sick or the hungry or the incarcerated, the thirsty, and we would add the grieving person and the immigrant, the teenager and the child, the lonely, the discriminated against, the elderly, the unemployed, the homeless and unsheltered, the disabled or other able, the mentally ill. Jesus said, "You did it to me." Mm-hmm. Can we envision a circle, so to speak, where all of us, the whole human family, cares for each other? Can we see that our care for one another is also the care for the world, the earth and creatures, things, and what is unseen too? We are engaged in an emptying out, a pouring out, following Jesus, which happens throughout our lives as we become present first to the Spirit, to ourselves, to the human family, and to the world. Mother Teresa, is reported to have said, when you care for the dying person, you are caring for Jesus in all of his incredible disguises. Perhaps we can also see that this care is for all of creation. Are we the earth that has come to consciousness? Teach us how to pray, Lord. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In our journey to becoming lay ministers, as we look back on our lives and the calling to respond to the memory of our own healing journey, our grief, where do we see and recall who has been there for us? How has God revealed God's self to us in our pain, our suffering? Who has come to us, has been present with us in our journey, shared a word, offered a hug, held us? Where have we offered ourselves forgiveness and forgiven others? How have we acknowledged our shortcomings, confessed our mistakes and sins? Where have we made amends? How have we fostered self-compassion? Has our own suffering transformed us? Being present to our lives, always being held in the arms of the Holy One, becoming aware of presence itself, being with us always, even in the times of forgetting or turning away, will help us to practice the ministry of presence in being with dying and grieving people, the grieving world, the resilient world. And we will come to recognize that all kinds of suffering can be boiled down to loss and grief. We have a tendency to cling to what we know, since change is difficult and loss will bring about that change. Not accepting change to what is in our lives is what generates the suffering. Loss and grief trigger painful change, and we struggle to accept that change because it's so painful. Grief triggers enormous painful change, and denial kicks in to protect us. I have a dear friend who recently retired from a rape crisis center in San Antonio, where he worked as a therapist for many years. A blind man, he sees grief and loss in his clients appear like a dark cloud or heavy dark smoke with a different vision. Grief, including what is called anticipatory grief, is a state in which a person experiences the feeling of deep, painful sorrow, and it can occur before someone's own death or in someone close to a friend who is dying. But it can also be found as people anticipate loss in things not related to death. Who accompanies us in the middle of presence? Who is on our left side and stands by our right side? Who is it that walks step by step into the middle of death? Who is it that sits side by side in the middle of grief? Who is it that sits with us as we sit with the dying human or the grieving human? And who is sitting with them? So in all of these situations, as we enter into the caring relationship, we enter into sacred ground, sharing in the pain and joy of being. God precedes us, walks with us, as God sits with the one to whom we minister. It is ministering to God's self. Being there to enter into the realm of grief and dying with another, to show love and care, brings comfort and solace. In beginning the module on grief, coping with loss, we read this quote from M. Scott in his book, The Road Less Traveled. Life is difficult. Life is a series of problems. And since life is always difficult, it is full of pain as well as joy. Then we read, the ministry of presence is central to the ministry of caring for the dying or the grieving. By helping dying persons to maximize their resources and by helping grieving persons to progress through their cycle of grief, lay pastoral caregivers can bring confidence and hope to the suffering. He also writes, it is imperative that lay pastoral caregivers begin to come to terms with their own fears and feelings about death and loss. Our own faith resources, our family and cultural background, our experiences in life are the material on which we draw when we minister to others. The goal of lay pastoral caregivers is to embody God's loving presence, protection, and guidance in the midst of suffering, to bring hope to the bereaved. Our challenge is to enter into the relationship and making whole with humility, a sense of entering the unknown, ears and eyes wide open, heart, mind aware and vulnerable, able to bear witness to the suffering and transformations that are taking place in the sorrow and the powerlessness that one is undergoing as change occurs. It's vital that we engage in our own fears of dying. We're raised in a culture that is death denying, and we can see that in any institution, including the church. But as Franco Staszewski, founder of Zen Hospice in San Francisco, and author of The 5 Invitations, What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully, says, I'm not a romantic about death. He also writes that the boundlessness of love is made evident when the veils between this world and the invisible world are thinnest. At birth and death, love melts any division. In such moments, we glimpse a love without limitation. This is an entirely different order of love, one that springs from the very source of our being. It recognizes and responds to the intrinsic goodness of the human heart. It is both profoundly receptive and dynamically expressive. It is always present. In a way, it is a background for all experience, the very essence of our being.
Say that.
I've just been asked to say that again. Frank writes, I am not a romantic about death. He says, the boundlessness of love is made evident when the veils between this world and the invisible world are thinnest. At birth and death, love melts any division. In such moments, we glimpse a love without limitation. This is an entirely different order of love, one that springs from the very source of our being. It recognizes and responds to the intrinsic goodness of the human heart. It is both profoundly receptive and dynamically expressive. It is always present. In a way, it is a background for all experience, the very essence of our being. How we get to know death means how we realize it is life's constant companion. No death, no life, no life, no death. I remember reading what Father Lawrence Freeman, in his book, A Short Span of Days, Meditation and Care for the Dying Patient, Family and Caregiver, writes. He writes that meditation is the first death. He means, of course, the death of the ego, which allows us to be attuned to the present moment. So Saint Benedict in his rule encourages that we keep death daily before our eyes. Father Lawrence further says, on this side of the wall, according to the cloud of unknowing, we meet the sorrow of existence, the fact that we can only go so far, and then we're blocked by this ego consciousness, blocked from entering into the union, into the freedom, into the authenticity that we aspire to. But on the other side of the wall, we find the joy of being. So we pass little by little from sorrow, the sorrow of existence, to the joy of being. And then, in God's own time, the wall opens up. There's a passage through the ego. And we find ourselves, as John Main said, encountering the person of Jesus, the inner Christ, able to recognize the presence of the risen Christ, Christ in you. When we attend to people in grief and the dying, we remember that we bring presence, that we are presence. We are receiving the gift of life in the present moment, and we are releasing the present moment, dying to it. Always new, always letting go, always dying, always being reborn. Breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, attentive to the one to whom we are comforting, companioning. As Roshi Joan Halifax writes in Being with Dying, Cultivating Compassion and Fearlessness in the Presence of Death, grieving is a landscape that is so varied and so vast that it can be discovered only through one's own most intimate experience. It touches the one who is dying, those around the dying person, and those who survive. No one escapes its touch, nor in the end should we. The river of grief pulses deep inside all human beings, hidden from view, but its presence informs one's life at every turn. It can drive a person into the numbing habits of escape from suffering, or bring an individual face to face with his or her own humanity. I'd like to share a little bit about my formal education and training in caring for dying and grieving people, and in the work in which I've been immersed. I was living in Taos, New Mexico in the 1980s. I'm also an artist and have moved there to write and paint. As recovery in a 12-step program progressed over a few years, when addiction became a life or death problem for me, I began to get reacquainted through the 12 steps with the very young boy I was, who felt a calling to service, ministry, and mystery. My sponsor, Jim Brown, of precious memory, but helped me to begin to practice more deeply the 11th step, which says, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, praying only for the knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. He introduced me to contemplative prayer as taught in particular by Father John May. After his death in 1982, Father Lawrence Freeman carried on Maine's teaching and formed the World Community for Meditation in 1991. It has become a global spiritual community united in the practice of meditation in the Christian tradition. It was alongside that commitment to daily meditation that I decided to explore the calling to service, ministry, and mystery. And after visiting schools where counseling programs are being offered, I decided to attend the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Hospice Institute in El Rito, New Mexico, and completed a degree in hospice and grief counseling. It was a very unusual degree program, and to my knowledge, the only one of its kind in the country. Unfortunately, it's no longer there. The two-year program was integrated to do one's own work in grief, as well as to receive the foundation's tools and training to work in a hospice organization. We studied everything from grant writing to personal care to grief work to the history of hospice. We studied the characteristics of rural hospice. We read and studied Who Dies? And a conscious investigation of dying by Stephen Levine, and other formational books like Kubler-Ross on Death and Dying. And importantly, we're taught about concepts and practices of dying and death by people from local spiritual communities, including Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, and Pueblo. To complete the requirements to graduate, I applied to a small hospice in Uvalde, Texas, in 1993, whose founders were occasional guests at the Institute for a 3-month internship at a small nonprofit. It's there that I met Patsy. We were in the same orientation class together, she as a new volunteer coordinator, me as a student intern. We were assigned to visit churches, service organizations, community centers in our 11-county area, introducing the hospice concept, which was so new, relatively so, and the Medicare benefit, and trying to start new volunteer guilds for the hospice with some success. About a week before completing the internship, after 3 months, I was offered a full-time job as the bereavement coordinator. And there was something special that was happening in our relationship. I needed to go to the wilderness and pray. Having met this amazing woman in Texas, she seemed to be my soulmate. I was returning to Taos where I had planned to live my whole life. I wrote to Patsy from the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, where I camped for several days. We knew where we were meant to meet and work together. Patsy is also an artist, and invited her to Taos, where she had never been, for a visit. I wrote to her when I was in the Gila Wilderness about a vision I had experienced that imagined contemplative spiritual care could be provided to dying people in a devoted community based on the origins of hospice I learned about studying its history at the Institute. Monks and nuns in monasteries and convents in the Middle Ages recognized that God's presence was close, so the dying were given the best straw mattresses, the cell with the most light, candles lit throughout the night, chanting, incense, companionship, prayer, sacraments, and silence. I wanted to form a community like that. I wanted to be part of a community like that and conceive of it first as a group of spiritually devoted people living together and caring for the dying. That changed to a better, more conceivable model as time and experience came to bear. Patsy visited me in Taos that summer in 1993, and I moved to Uvalde 6 months after we met to begin full-time work for the hospice and the bereavement coordinator. We were married a little more than a year later. We moved to San Antonio a few years after that. I was commissioned by the Diocese of West Texas as a hospice chaplain. Since we met, Patsy and I have collaborated in the sphere of dying and death and community in innumerable ways. The vision I wrote to Patsy about led to our founding of Abode Contemplative Care for the Dying 17 years later, after I wrote her from the wilderness. Abode was founded in 2010, and it's an inter-spiritual nonprofit organization which continues to build a community to care for the dying person and their loved ones, as well as to be a resource in the community for education about dying and grief. We have a particular focus that guides the way we tend to care for our guests and care of each other, which is to learn to be present through contemplative practices and learn from the world's great spiritual traditions. Contemplative care simply focuses on responding in the moment, being present and helping through hands-on care in the unique sacred transition of dying. The care is personal, aspires to be selfless and compassionate. Honoring all faith traditions of the guests, contemplative presence is the foundation of Abode. Through the generosity of many co-creators, volunteers, and donors, we raised the money to design, build, and furnish a beautiful home with 3 bedrooms on a property full of trees and bedroom doors that open to a patio where guests can be rolled out in their bed or wheelchair to breathe in the fresh air and sun. We care for dying people in the last few months of life at no charge for hospice patients who don't have adequate housing or caregiving. Taking our first guest in December of 2014, Abode has cared for nearly 400 guests now, as hospice agencies refer their patients to us and teach our end-of-life navigators, our small staff, and volunteers how to care for our guest, their patient. We're part of an organization called the Omega Home Network, which seeks to establish homes with a similar mission around the country to care for dying people at no cost. There are about 40 of these homes around the country now, with that many in development. In Texas, there are 3 homes. We offer hospitality and welcome each and every person who comes through the door. We invite contemplative awareness through yoga, meditation groups, a drumming circle, and sound healing. Our executive director, Mary Thorsby, held a 2-day training for about 40 new volunteers around 3 weeks ago. Every month, we offer the Death Cafe, where people gather at Abode to drink tea, eat cake, and have an agenda-free discussion about death. We are also offering training to become an end-of-life doula. And just in a few weeks, we'll start into our 5th cohort of people who've been through that program. Let me tell you about our first guest at Abode. In December 2014, our small staff and volunteers welcomed Carl, a 35-year-old man, a hospice patient, and began to care for him. He'd been diagnosed with advanced and quickly spreading cancer, and the hospice agency recommended Abode. He didn't want to come, but his father could not bear to see his son die in the family home, having witnessed death in war as a veteran in the Vietnam War. Carl had always lived with his parents. He had needed care his whole life due to a chronic disease. When Carl arrived and was welcomed, he seemed to relax, saying, "This place is beautiful." He declined very quickly, much more so than his hospice team thought would happen. Our small staff and volunteers cared for him attentively through the professional guidance of the hospice team. In the beginning of his stay at Abode, his father wasn't able to be in the bedroom with him, preferring instead to sit in the quiet room with the door closed, where we would offer support, often through just sitting with him. What is there to say? At times there's nothing, and we trust the presence of the Spirit is always at hand. At the moment that seemed right, he was invited and encouraged to come to Carl's bedroom to be with him as he neared death. And there, son and father came together as one, dying and living in a state of release, of letting go. He died 24 hours after he came to abode. We sensed gratitude and sadness in the peace that held their grief too, because father, son, and mother had been together again in the most intimate of ways at the very end of Carl's life, witnessing that they were held together in a sacred heart space. During the pandemic, we began offering Zoom trainings in the newly formed Abode Academy over several weeks. In April this year, the Academy's topic was grief. One of the presenters was Peg Armstrong, a grief counselor in San Antonio, who, along with other grief counselors based on Kübler-Ross's model, describes disbelief, anger, bargaining, depression as normal responses to pain and loss. Until we explore, talk about, and really feel our pain, healing will be out of reach, she says. In her experience of grief counseling over many years, she describes it as the heaviest emotional thing that will happen to you, the hardest stab in the heart and the spirit and the mind. In the process of healing a grief, a person will come to recognize that she isn't the only one who's lost a child or a spouse, that millions of people are undergoing the same experience, and we can see that we all share suffering together, and that compassion, suffering with, in the darkness, with no answers that are adequate, no insight except for human, that we all die, and that we all will grieve. How can we be with that? It can take some time of giving attention to grief, of being with it, to learn to live with it, to integrate grief into our daily lives. And in some ways, are we all learning to live with grief, to integrate it in our daily lives, where we see so much violence and destruction and loss around us in the world? War, natural disasters, political violence. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Compassion for the world where there is so much suffering, and to those who accompany and love on an intimate personal level. I recall a visit I made to a Catholic church near Uvalde when I worked for hospice there and spoke during the time set aside for a sermon. As I describe hospice, its team's approach to helping a family learn how to care at home for someone who was terminally ill and how a chaplain could help with the spiritual care, I became aware that the congregation as a whole seemed to be distant, not really listening. Lack of expression on their faces, almost a blank stare. Patsy and I had noticed over the years that when we talked about hospice, that is, dying in death and grief, it was common for an audience to become engaged. What was striking about this experience was that as I finished, we went back to the pew, turned toward the altar. There on the back wall was a very large corpus depicting the body of Jesus hanging dead on a cross. How can it be, I think, even in the depiction of death, the celebration of the Mass, the description of the crucifixion, celebration of the Eucharist, can we so often turn away from death as if it's not ever present? Our inclination in order to help may be to fix the person we encounter in all of her distress, to take away her pain, to change her. In that sense, we are no longer present, and we become attuned to the fact that being a witness to suffering as a companion, experiencing compassion for those who suffer and not turning away, is where healing can begin. John was a young man in his 30s who was dying from AIDS. He'd been living on the street, and many in his large Catholic family had struggled to know how to relate to him and how to help him, how to forgive and be forgiven as he lay dying in a hospice inpatient unit. His symptoms of pain and anxiety were controlled with medications. His parents and siblings were often there. His younger sister rarely left his bedside over the days he lay dying, eyes closed, barely communicating verbally, though at times reaching out with his hand or uttering something. Their priest came to anoint him with the sacrament of the sick, inviting them to join in the blessing, being attentive to their grief. As a chaplain on the hospice team, I encouraged his family when I visited to say, to speak, to whisper in whatever words they could find that they loved him, forgave him, and to ask him for his forgiveness. I encouraged them to pray, to acknowledge their need, to find the way to forgiveness for themselves. His sister shared with them that she felt love in the room. Mostly, I encouraged them just to sit with him, be there. His sister comforted him by wetting his lips with a swab, touching his hand, laying her head on his chest. She would weep, and one time she asked if I could sit with her in the room with him. She told me she couldn't believe he was dying, but was trying to accept it. She loved him deeply and felt he could hear and believe what they were saying to him, and in a way, he would always be with her. She felt forgiveness, but she seemed sure that he was hanging on. His breath was so shallow now. There had been one brother who hadn't come to see him, and later in the day, he came. They gave him time to be together, and shortly afterward, he died. He died peacefully as the breath floats away, with them at his bedside, softly weeping. A few months later, his sister called me, and she said she wanted to tell me that she was driving in the neighborhood where her brother was often seen. As she drove by a bus stop, she said she saw her brother sitting on the bus stop bench, and he looked at her as he noticed her driving by. She said she saw him wave to her. When she turned around and drove back by, she didn't see him any longer. She felt sure he was with her and was at peace. I'd like to share a poem with you by Juan Ramon Jimenez. It's called I Am Not I. I am not I. I am this one, walking beside me, whom I do not see, whom at times I manage to visit, and whom at other times I forget. He remains calm and silent while I talk, and forgives gently when I hate, who walks where I am not, who will remain standing when I die. What we become in this middle way, which is to say where we have balance, when we have opened ourselves to the possibility of serving others in concert with God who loves us, calls us by name, and calls all of the creation in a magnificent chorus with each and everything being attuned to the sound or essence of its own name, so that humming and tingling, a tickling, a burning, a wetness or dryness that belongs only to that thing is known. Love and grief and joy and death are all channels for transformation. And to know it is so, each atom of creation has within it the harmony inherent in the unveiling of the moment, the present moment. In the atom and dark matter, in storms, in conflicts, in war, in peace, in creatures great and small, we're in the ministry of presence resides, and with which we experience our tender heart, our strong back, our soft front, as we become acquainted with her, with presence, and invite presence into our daily life. She awaits us. We see her in others. She is always there. What is this presence that we minister with? Is it presence itself, love itself, love that allows or shows the person who is called or invited to know it, that it is revealed? Or it can be darkness, nothing revealed, nothing shown. In the ordinary living of everyday life, if we're aware, awake, present to what is, there is the possibility of awe and gratitude, and to accompany the other in his or her distress and grief and loss and dying, to suffer with, to bring compassion, This is presence in action, presence meeting presence. It is not the I of the ego who does this. Rather, it's the humility of the human divine oneness which guides the listener into the heart of the grieving, the dying, the body which is diminished, which is doing what it does in all cases, in all times, in all places. So briefly we have come, so swiftly we shall go. So that way we will know each other. We will share the fears, the joys, the unexpected thumping of our hearts in unison, gazing upon the wonders of the everyday moment. We will be in awe. How do we embody and experience God's presence in ourselves so that we can be of service to others? In the Community of Hope International notebook, we read, "You will discover that deep silence is for listening to God with the ear of your heart, and compassionate listening is God's gift of presence and awe." We can say this is how we come to know and experience the ministry of presence, that through deep silence and a listening heart, we encounter a presence who walks with us through the forever now. Sitting beside someone in pain involves a commitment to abide with that person in holy presence, honoring them and their suffering with our full presence. "Just sit by me on the mourning bench," writes Nicholas Walsterhoff in the CoHI notebook. Part of sitting beside another on a mourning bench requires a willingness to hear that person's story, to recognize and acknowledge that we are part of one another, that we belong to one another's story just by being there. Walsterstorff says, "That loss of my son determines my identity. Not all of my identity, but much of it. It belongs within my story. I struggle, indeed, to go beyond merely owning my grief towards owning it redemptively. But I will not and cannot disown it. Lament is part of life. Every lament is a love song. Every lament is a love song." We are what we do with silence. In silence, we lay aside our hopes, worries, and preoccupations so that we may live in the present moment, which is the only moment that is. Silence centers us on the Christ within. It allows us to simply be and be simply in the presence of God. Christian meditation in silence and solitude is a spiritual discipline that works and progresses. It grounds us in the most important work that Jesus asks us to do, leave self behind. In such a release of ego, will we truly see God in ourselves, in others, in all things? Let me end this talk with this. Contemplative prayer, which embeds us in the ministry of presence, brings only growth in Christ, as John Main explains. It is not a growth in the quality of our prayer per se, but in the quality of our life and our love. The practitioner can realize in daily life the 5 fruits of spiritual maturity flowing from contemplative prayer. A greater recognition of the true self in God, not the false self raised by the ego. A deeper emotional stability. A greater intellectual clarity. A greater capacity to center on others and away from self. A greater love and an awareness of love as the essential energy of life. And Lawrence Freeman adds, from a short span of days, one of life's key experiences is the experience of loss, of detachment, of death, of the many deaths we die, as we gradually let go of our own egos and get in touch with the life of Christ within each of us. The Abode mission statement reads, "We teach the art of contemplative living and dying while providing a beautiful home and compassionate care for those at end of life at no charge." Our vision reads, "We live in a world where death is not feared, and we live fully until we die." In the Buddhist tradition, there's something that is often offered at the end of a period of zazen, of people sitting together. It's called the ending gatha, or the ending prayer. And it goes like this. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost. Each of us should strive to awaken. Take heed. This day, your days are diminished by one. Do not squander your life. Thank you. End with a little meditation to share with you. I was at a gathering the other day of some other spiritual directors, and it was a gathering, a feast gathering, and the theme was love. And so, we sat together and we had a chance to have something presented to us from the 5 invitations that I mentioned earlier by Franco Staszewski, what death can teach us about life. And there are 5 invitations that he offers, and I'll just share these with you and invite it, sort of a lectio kind of approach to this. As I read it through maybe twice, we'll have about 5 or 7 minutes to do this. As I read it through twice, just see if there's a word or phrase that kind of leaps out at you that you can maybe reflect on later today, and see if this might be a way to carry on. So these are the 5 invitations. I'll read them first without some of the commentary behind them, but these are the 5 invitations. Don't wait. Welcome everything. Push away nothing. Bring your whole self to the experience. Find a place in the middle of things. Cultivate, don't know mind. So here are, number 4 was find a place in the middle of things.
And number 5, please.
Cultivate, don't know mind. And so here's what I'd like to share with you with these
Cultivate, don't know mind. Okay.
Cultivate, don't know mind. Mm-hmm. And I think we might be able to see these on screen as I go through them with you. So here is the commentary from the first invitation, don't wait. Blossom into a happy, relaxed, and joyous state. Deeply engage with life. Purification of memories. I want my joy to be in you and your joy to be complete. Be kinder, more compassionate, and forgiving. Welcome everything, push nothing away. Suspend the rush to judgment. Am I projecting onto the other? Is the other a projection of I? Open to paradox and contradiction as a response to life. Welcome everything as an act of love. The third invitation. Bring your whole self to the experience. We all experience helplessness, fear, anger, ignorance. Thoughts are not facts. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means no part left behind. The fourth invitation. Find a place in the middle of things. Rest is a choice to be alert, to bring your attention fully to this moment. And the fifth invitation. Cultivate don't know mind. Fertility of imagination. Have a mind of curiosity, surprise, and wonder. Be receptive, ready to meet whatever shows up. Empty your mind and open your heart. I'll read them one more time. And there's five invitations. Number one, don't wait. Don't wait. Blossom into a happy, relaxed, and joyous state. Deeply engage with life. Purification of memories. I want my joy to be in you and your joy to be complete. Be kinder, more compassionate, and forgiving. The second invitation. Welcome everything. Push nothing away. Suspend the rush to judgment. Am I projecting onto the other? Is the other a projection of I? Open to paradox and contradiction as a response to life. Welcome everything as an act of love. Third invitation, bring your whole self to the experience. We all experience helplessness, fear, anger, ignorance. Thoughts are not facts. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means no part left behind. Find a place in the middle of things, the fourth invitation. Rest is a choice to be alert, to bring your attention fully to this moment. The fifth invitation, cultivate don't know mind. Fertility of imagination. Have a mind of curiosity, surprise, and wonder. Be receptive, ready to meet whatever shows up. Enter your mind and open your heart.
That last one.
At this time, if there's anyone who has a question or a comment for Edwin, please feel free to make that known. Thank you, Edwin, by the way, that was very moving.
Edwin, where did you get that shirt?
Oh my God.
House.
I'd like to get that shit
Yeah,
That
House.
whole series talk, and that's what he.
a month ago. It's made in Nepal.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard that.
Did you
Thank
hear
you. Yeah.
that?
No.
Any other questions or comments?
I have one. Number 2, welcome everything, push nothing away. And then under that, it says, welcome everything as an act of love.
Mhm.
Can you elaborate a little bit? Can you explain? Tell me more.
Sure. Well, in the context of welcoming everything, if we can imagine that experience exists in the present moment, then the opportunity then is to push anything away. That's how I would best try to explain that. So, so even if in a sense, I could say, I'm in the middle of grief, and I accept that, don't push it away, welcoming everything. If I'm having a moment on the highway when I'm driving and somebody's going in front of me way too slowly. And I find my chagrin raising up. And I notice that in that chagrin, that I'm forgetting entirely what I'm doing, which is driving, which recognizes also that that person in front of me who's going much slowly than I want to, and I'm finding myself getting emotionally entangled. And I'm saying to myself, well, wait, what I'm doing is I'm driving. And really what I'm doing is sharing this road space. And really that person in front of me who's driving so slowly, well, who knows what's going on in her life? And I realize that as I'm driving, I can really attend to just driving, to being in the moment. That's welcoming everything, pushing nothing away. So those are two examples that I think might kind of be able to be translated into everyday life.
Thank you.
Whatever experience it is, if I become aware of it, of the experience, and oftentimes, thoughts immediately translate into feelings. I have an emotional response to those feelings. So if I'm thinking something and I notice chagrin raise up, when I'm noticing that, that's just an appearance of consciousness. And I have the choice then to focus on the moment rather than this emotional content that really distracts me from welcoming everything. I don't know if that helps. I hope it helps a little bit.
Other questions, comments?
May we please get a copy of that?
Yes, yes.
The sheet, the one sheet?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'll be sure everybody gets that.
Thank you.
I would like to share with you too that this particular reflection is based on some of Frank Ostaseski's invitation, but also filled with some of the person's comments too, who presented this to us the other day for our contemplative feast of love. And if you would really like to delve into what Frank's teachings are, I would really recommend the book. It's a fantastic book, as is Being Was Dying by Joan Halifax, both of whom are Buddhist teachers.
I'm going to ask Edwin, he doesn't know this, but I'm going to ask him if he'll send us a bibliography
Oh, sure. Yeah.
of the books that he used in his presentation and other useful books on helping the dying, and I'll get it out to everybody.
Sure.
And I'd like to have the poetry and the readings that you read.
Okay. Do you mean the quotes from things that I was writing from?
Yeah, your quotations, but mostly that poetry was,
Oh, sure.
Toward the end.
especially that last one. Oh my gosh. So thank you.
Yeah, I know. Right. Sure. I'd be happy to send that. I'll send it. So you get it.
I'd also like to say that Abode's website is very rich in educational information. And it is abodehome.org. It's very simple, abodehome.org. I encourage you to go to that site and look at the rich resources that are there. There's also some bios, right, of people who had their last few minutes at Abode, which is lovely. It's a lovely, lovely place. They do also welcome visitors. So if your center would like to go to Abode, you just have to call and arrange something with Mary or Edwin. They're very welcoming hosts, and it will be a wonderful learning experience for you.
We'd love to have you come by. And if you want to come by as an individual, one day of the week that I would recommend is Thursday at 11 o'clock for meditation, followed by community lunch around the dining room table. And so you'd be welcome to come at any time.
Edwin, this is Teresa. I have a question. I love the peace, and I feel the presence of the spirit in all that you've shared with us. What are your tips on how to deal with when I find people grieving, the panic and maybe some imagery that they have that might be Christian or some religious, that they may be having to resolve in their mind? How do you help coach them, or how do you help them resolve and come to a place of peace?
Can you give me an example?
Change is hard, grief is difficult, panicking because things will be changed, unresolved issues, and just letting people enjoy themselves where they're at and accepting what is.
Yeah, that's really good. I think really when we're encountering someone as a companion in the presence of grief, that we just have to let grief be. And I by that I mean is that, by being present to someone as they're sharing as much as they can about their loss, and it can be very deeply emotional, that allowing a person to cry, to weep, for example, is just exactly what might be needed then. And I think what we have to be careful about is fixing grief, is helping someone transcend those feelings before he or she is ready. Because really, if we intervene in the sense that we try to take it away or try to heal it without a proper attention to the time that it takes, to the recommendation that, for example, I would be probably, just depending on what time has lapsed since a death when someone is grieving so intently, I would probably recommend grief counseling. I'd recommend a grief support group, for example, that might be really, really needed at some point. But really, it's like the man who talked about in the Community of Hope notebook. He talked about just sitting with me on the, how does he put it?
On the morning bench.
Just sit with me on the morning bench. That was just so moving when I read that. Because that's really, really at ground, at root, what people most often would want. And one thing I might also notice too is the person asking for something that I can help with. One of the things that I realized in hospice work, for example, is that when someone is dying, or someone is grieving, or someone is anticipating his or her death, and they want a chaplain to come by, and sometimes, the visit is, sharing something about their journey. They might be thinking about their legacy. They might want to talk about some of the relationships that have been harmed or hindered, whatever it might be. One of the things that I've learned to do too is not to assume that I know, for example, if they want to pray or what they want to pray about. So I might ask them, would you like prayer? And then to accept whether they find that that's what they're wanting to receive or not. And then to ask them, if they say yes, is ask them, and what would you like to pray for? Rather than assuming that I know what that prayer would be. Yeah. Because, it's just really attending then to that person's need in that moment. And they might say, whatever you'd like to pray, chaplain, which is fine too, right? I mean, we can go with that because we've been listening. We can hear what their concerns are. We can lift them up in prayer, for example. So I think that's a really helpful thing. And also, one of the things that we talk about in healing, in grief and in dying, is that healing really is a process, and it's not just physical healing that we're talking about. And oftentimes when a person is dying, physical healing is not likely to be the outcome. However, spiritual healing and emotional healing and the healing of God is always happening. It might not be happening the way that I want it to happen or perceive it to be or expect it to be, but healing is a matter of trusting that it's always occurring. It's always happening.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
Could you say that last little bit again? Trusting that.
let's see, I was saying that a healing is always happening, that it's trusting that it's always happening, that it may not occur the way that we would want it to occur, or even the way that we pray for it to occur. But to trust that God is always healing. It's not always a physical healing. It's not always an emotional healing. It's not, I guess we could probably say there's always a spiritual healing that's happening, whether I'm aware of it or not. And that it doesn't always come in our timing. So patience and trust and knowing that we're held and loved, I think, is kind of the root of how we can experience and hope for that.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I wanted to just say thank you. That was very packed full of great information. This is our second training that we're doing in Community of Hope. And I remember from the first training, the two big things I remember: listen with your heart, and the other is the morning bench. That to me, the morning bench is a very good way, even though it was used in Jewish times, and I think still is to some extent. It really fits for what we do when we're in the presence of somebody who needs a lay chaplain, is that you're listening with your heart. And sometimes you're listening to people that you've known and haven't really known very well, or didn't really want to know really well. And if you listen with your heart, that just makes that all go away. And then the morning bench, even if you're not visiting somebody who's dying, it puts you in the sense of really, really being present. But a couple of weeks ago, we had a speaker who also talked about bringing God into your presence as you're being with people. And ever since we heard that, I have been using that imagery also, because I didn't have that in my visiting with people before. Only if we prayed, I might think about it a little bit, but to me now it's something that has helped me bring God into the presence of what I'm doing right now, regardless of a visit or what's going on. So you just had so many good things. And I have another story similar to yours. When my dad died, he was in a home hospice in New York, Rochester, New York. And he had planned to go to one that was not connected to the hospital, but one of the hospitals had like way off, actually outside of the hospital. I think it was above the parking lot or something. They had this little space that had about 5 rooms, and then an area for the family to bring meals in and those kinds of things. And there are 6, I have 5 siblings. One is currently estranged from the family, and we were all there except that one. And we were waiting, and my parents are Catholic, or were Catholic, and they wanted the priest. And so the priest came and prayed with us as a family. And the priest's name was Richard, which is also my father's name and the estranged son. And so after he left, my other brother and I went to return a rental car that had to be back like at a certain time. It was a few blocks away. And so we went to do that. And when we came back, my father had died, and my mother was convinced that he heard the name Richard and knew that we were all there.
Wow.
So that's my story.
Oh gosh, I know, it's such mystery, isn't there?
It really is.
Such
So
mystery.
thank you.
I wanted to say hello to my friend Gretchen Beeler too. Gretchen has been involved at Abode ever since we began meeting for our first meditation group at Viva Bookstore while the home was being built, and we started a meditation group there. And when it moved to Abode, Gretchen has been there every single time. So Monday nights at 5 o'clock, you can find a link for joining us for meditation via Zoom. We'd be happy to have you.
Via Zoom. Wow. You guys are really up to date.
It's been
Anything
really
else?
wonderful to be with you all.
Anybody else have a comment or anything to say?
Thank you very much.
I'm Pat.
and for the
I
work
did
that you
say-
do.
I did appreciate your saying, ask the person, do you want me to pray for you? How would you like me to pray? Because when my husband was dying, I was very much at peace for him dying. And I thought, and I'm with a lot of strong Christians. And I thought, I want Luke in Luke, where Simeon saw Jesus and said, I can go now, Lord. I have seen him. I said, that's what I want for my husband. He knows you and it is time. And so that's how I want you to pray, not so much for healing, but for peace. So I appreciate your saying that.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah.
It's a few minutes early, but I think we'll go ahead and go to breakouts.